Method acting is a system of training and practice developed by a variety of dramatic artists with the goal of encouraging authentic and expressive performances through connecting with, understanding, and feeling a character's underlying drive and emotions. Based in and around the Stanislavski system, the method form of acting forces the actor to take on the character 24/7 in everything they do. That way they can better understand who they are portraying and why they are making the decisions they make. Only then can they really accurately portray their subjects, as they are really showcasing who they are. In literature based around the method form of acting, the difference between method acting and regular acting can be reduced to one singular question. Regular actors are constantly having to ask themselves, what would motivate me, the actor, to behave in the way the character does? Which, it is argued, separates themselves from their roles and adds a layer of falsehood to their performance. Rather, method actors who live within their roles are asking the question, given the particular circumstances of the play, how would I behave? What would I do? How would I feel? And how would I react? Over the past couple of years, with the rise of method actors like Jared Leto using the method as a way to harass his coworkers and force the production to cater to his most insane requests, and other thespians like Robert Pattinson speaking out against the practice, the entire form of acting has come under fire. An actor should be able to portray a character without having to be the character in their personal life. But where does one draw the line? How do you play a villain without being one yourself? And why does Hollywood make so many excuses for this kind of behavior? Today, we are going to be covering the case of a man who made millions off of portraying some of cinema's most sadistic and evil characters, all the while hiding his own actions in plain sight. Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, this time brought to you by our patrons over at Patreon. Today we are going to be covering the case of Kevin Spacey and how he has been plagued with allegations of inappropriate and criminal behavior since the start of his career. This case was requested by over 35 subscribers of this channel. But if there is a topic or case you would like to see me cover next, please leave it in the comments down below. If you want the submission to stay private, feel free to send me an email at the email in the description down below. This video, like so many others of ours, has been copyright claimed and demonetized, meaning that all the ad revenue from this video goes to a third party. Lately, some of our videos have been blocked and privatized by the platform, though luckily they have been able to go back up. If you want to have full access to every single one of my videos, please consider checking out my Patreon, which is linked below. All of my videos are available there in their original forms, and there will always be copies of my videos available there to be watched should anything happen to this channel. To be precise, if YouTube were to completely demonetize this channel, I would still venture to make content. But if you wanted to support my endeavor, Patreon is available to you. With all of that said, let us begin. Kevin Spacey is a celebrity who prided himself on maintaining a certain amount of secrecy around his life. Almost every interview and article written about his life and career, a great deal of focus was given to why his personal life was so hidden and shadowy, to which Kevin would always respond that he wanted to be known for his acting only, and that his real life was his own. Many of his fans and colleagues appreciated this, and respected the actor for it. It isn't hard to find comments about how Kevin's attitude and temperament about his acting is like that of an older Hollywood star, and how his dedication to his craft and not public spectacle was something to be aspired to. But much like an old Hollywood star, Kevin used his secrecy to hide some of his more heinous behavior. With that in mind, there is very little information about Kevin's early life, as only two sources who have ever spoke about it were Kevin, who only gave vague information, and his brother, Randall, who painted a drastically different picture. Kevin Spacey was born Kevin Spacey Fowler, July 26, 1959. He was born to parents Kathleen and Thomas Fowler, and the home, according to Kevin, was nothing if not normal. Spacey was the youngest of three kids, Julie and Randall Fowler, and was the baby of the group. Kevin would state that his family, and most notably his dad, was very normal and middle class, and his childhood, with the exception of a few tales given during interviews about capers he got into, was entirely unnoteworthy. His brother, Randall Fowler, would deeply disagree with his brother's summation of their early lives, and in 2004 stated that their father was a wildly abusive man who assaulted both of them physically and sexually. He went further to state that his father was a Nazi and collected World War II paraphernalia, and at times used it to beat them. Randall went on to claim that his father cut his mustache to honor Adolf Hitler, and would often go on rants during dinner about the state of the world. In an interview Randall gave with the Daily Mail, he would label his father a Nazi child rapist who hated Jews and brutalized the entire family, leaving every member with irreparable mental and physical wounds. For his part, Randall stated that he refused to have his own children for fear that he would pass down any of the abuse or torture his father gave to him, and believed that his childhood was the reason that his marriages and relationships continued to fall apart. His father isolated the family, banning kids from having any friends over or going out on their own. Their house served as a prison for the kids, and Randall alleged that in order to deal with the various abuse he was put through, he wrapped himself in an emotional bubble, hiding his true self from the world. He believed that his brother turned to acting the same way he had turned to impersonations, as fantasizing about being another person was the only real way to cope with what was going on. For his part, his sister Julie has never spoken in defense of her brother or their family, but is reported to have a healthy relationship with Kevin, as she stated he loves her kids and being an uncle. Regardless of which assessment of the Fowler household is correct, remains to be seen, but Kevin would leave the house rather early, as when he was in the 10th grade, he was sent to a military academy after burning down his sister's treehouse. His stint in the academy only lasted 2 years, though he was expelled in the 11th grade after throwing a tire at a classmate during a boxing match. After being expelled, Spacey was enrolled in Chatsworth High School, where he would begin to pursue acting after his school counselor would recommend he look into healthy outlets for his energy and need for attention. For Kevin, it seemed to be exactly what he needed, and he took to the stage like a fish to water. Many of the people around him remarked on the notable change to his personality, as it seemed that he had found what drove him. He later graduated co-valedictorian in 1977, and after began to pursue a career on stage in whatever form he could. At first, Kevin was interested in stand-up as it required less auditioning and rejection. He would go to bowling alley talent contests and comedy clubs during open mic nights and do impressions to middling success. Some of the comedians around him, but he was green and needed more time to learn the craft. However, Spacey didn't know if comedy was the route he really wanted to pursue. After some encouragement from his friend from school, Val Kilmer, Kevin applied to Juilliard and was one of the 28 students accepted into the class in 1979. In an essay about his former teacher, Marianne Seldes, Kevin recalled his short tenure at the prestigious school fondly, stating that she was the first person in his life who truly believed in his talents and abilities. He also referenced the fact that he had left the school after only 2 years of classes and might have been kicked out, though that was never directly reported. Shortly after leaving Juilliard, Kevin would be on the road to becoming the star the world would come to know him as, and go on to create a reputation for trying to take advantage of those unfortunate enough to get in his line of vision. The following portion of this video is going to include the statements of multiple victims who have come forward against Kevin, and some are graphic in nature. If you are at all sensitive towards discussions of sexual assault, it might be beneficial for you to leave the video now to protect your mental well-being. Please look after yourself, and do not consume the rest of the video if you have even an inkling that this might be hurtful to you. One common misconception about Kevin Spacey and the allegations against him is that people only came forward during the Me Too movement in 2017, and that prior to that, no allegations had been made. However, that is patently false, as for as long as Kevin had been working, he had had men and women allege that he had been inappropriate with them, to the point that Netflix had to put a sexual misconduct clause in his contract, and Family Guy had made a joke out of it years prior.
$10. $5. $8 and I'll do it. Fine. Help! I've escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement! Help me!
Much like with Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer, and Bill Cosby, Kevin Spacey's repeated sexual advances and assaults were well known in the industry and considered an open secret. To properly showcase the breadth of some of the claims and how well known they were to people in the industry, as we discuss Kevin's career, we will intersperse the alleged offenses as they occurred. In 1981, Kevin made his professional stage debut as a spear carrier in the New York Shakespeare Festival. He had various small roles prior, which he would describe in an article for The New Yorker as embarrassing and pathetically bad. But from this small role, he had gotten his foot in the door. The next year, 1982, Kevin made his Broadway debut as Oswald in Ghosts by Henrik Ibsen. Following that, he portrayed Valente in Molière's The Misanthrope in 1983. At the same time, Kevin began a year-long sexual relationship with a 14-year-old boy he had met 2 years prior when he was just 12. According to the anonymous victim who came forward in 2017, but had spoken publicly about the assaults beginning in 1990, he first met Kevin in 1981, when Kevin was a guest teacher at an acting class he was enrolled in. At the time of their original meeting, Kevin was 22, and when he began seeing the minor, he was 24 and on Broadway. According to the anonymous victim's statements, Kevin gave the boy his number after they ran into each other in Central Park, and when he called him the next day, Kevin declared he was in love with him and had been since he was 12, but had stayed away due to age. Kevin love-bombed the child and told him that there were producers he knew that were interested in the 14-year-old boy for a number of roles. This, of course, was not true, and just a tactic that Kevin used to groom the child. The victim stated that they continued to see each other for a year, in which they repeatedly had sex. But the last time he saw Kevin, he had been physically abusive and tried to further take advantage of the situation. To be clear, their entire relationship, as described by the victim, was abuse. I only use the word relationship as it's what the victim used, and they stated it properly described how he felt about Kevin at the time, being a child. During that night, the boy got uncomfortable with how forceful Kevin was and told him to stop, but Kevin held him down and tried to physically dominate him. The boy was able to push Kevin off of him and left the apartment in a hurry, feeling incredibly violated and taken advantage of. After that, their relationship ended, and he only heard from Kevin once after, then blocked any contact. The next year, in 1984, Kevin appeared in a production of David Rabe's Hurly-Burly, followed shortly thereafter by a role in Chekhov's The Seagull, at which point Spacey allegedly asked a 17-year-old boy to fly from England to New York to spend the weekend with him. The boy had met Kevin in 1984, during summer theater when he was just 16. The pair had a friendship, which he went on to describe in hindsight as predatory and grooming, and after a year of conversation, Kevin asked if he could fly out to see him. According to the boy, Spacey went from being brotherly and kind to being sexually aggressive and inappropriate. At first, Kevin took him out to dinner and introduced him to some famous friends, and then began to touch him inappropriately. The boy rejected Spacey's sexual advances outright, and Spacey turned cold towards him in an attempt to emotionally manipulate the boy into sex. The 17-year-old John Doe fell asleep on the couch, listening to Kevin cry in his room, and felt incredibly uncomfortable about the entire ordeal. However, he woke up to Kevin's head on his stomach, arms wrapped around his body, with Kevin wearing only his underwear. He left and never spoke to Kevin Spacey again. In 1986, he appeared in a production of Sleuth in a New Jersey dinner theater, followed in close succession by his role in Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night as Jamie, which was highly lauded. On that very production, Kevin targeted a 17-year-old production assistant, Kate Edwards, and invited her to his home for a party he was throwing. However, after she got there was no one present, as he used that as an excuse to get her alone. He began to kiss her and grope her, and she asked him when the other party-goers would arrive, but he refused to answer her, and she realized that it had all been a ploy to get her to get to his home. She told him she wanted to go home and change for the party, citing that she felt underdressed, and, like he had before, he turned cold on her and said she could find her own way home. After the encounter, he refused to acknowledge her on set, and she became depressed, not understanding that she had done anything wrong. That same year, Kevin assaulted Anthony Rapp when he was just 14 years old. Anthony and Kevin were both working actors, and Casey had befriended Rapp when they were both on Broadway. Anthony thought the friendship was just that, friendship, and if anything, they were co-workers as actors. He felt respected by the 26-year-old, and cool that he, as a kid, was able to hang out with him. Spacey took Rapp to bars and clubs around New York. Despite the fact that Anthony looked much younger than 14, he invited him to parties and shows, and it was because of that Anthony felt more comfortable saying yes when Kevin invited him to a party at his house. When Anthony arrived at the party, he quickly realized that he was the only child there, and everyone else was above drinking age. He felt weird, and instead of hanging around with the adults, he wandered into a bedroom and watched TV for the entire night. He said the following about that night: "My memory was what I thought. Oh, everyone's gone. Well, yeah, I should probably go home." Spacey sort of stood in the doorway, kind of swaying. My impression when he came into the room was that he was drunk. He picked me up like a groom picks up the bride over the threshold, but I don't squirm away initially, because I'm like, what's going on? And then he lays down on top of me. He was trying to seduce me. I don't know if I would have used that language, but I was aware that he was trying to get with me sexually. Rapp was able to push Spacey off of him and lock himself in a bathroom for a short while. He composed himself and then told Spacey that he was going to leave, at which point Kevin, leaning in the doorframe, asked if he really had to go, but didn't stop Anthony as he left. That same year, he made his film debut in Mike Nichols' Heartburn, alongside Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson. His part was small, but he was so well received that he would then go on to appear in another Nichols film, Working Girl. Kevin's celebrity continued to rise in the theater and movie scene, and he nabbed a role in the Long Wet Theater's production of National Anthem, and in 1988 he became involved with another minor. Justin Dawes was a volunteer usher at the theater and had met Spacey, who was 29 at the time, backstage. He told Dawes that he was throwing a party in his apartment to show Roman Polanski's Chinatown and asked if he and his friend would like to come over. The boys agreed, but just like with Kate, when they arrived at the actor's apartment, no one was present. Spacey made the boys drinks and put gay pornography on instead of Chinatown, and told the boys that everyone who was supposed to come over decided not to come over last minute. After a short while, the boys left, telling Spacey they had somewhere to be. Spacey tried to convince them to stay, but the boys left, and he never spoke to them again. That same year, he would star in The Murder of Mary Fagan, a two-part miniseries that starred Jack Lemmon and Cynthia Nixon. In 1989, he starred in See No Evil, Hear No Evil, a comedy film starring Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder. In the year that followed, he went back to stage and played Uncle Louie in Neil Simon's Lost in Yonkers, which ultimately earned him a Tony Award. The next 4 years, he continued to get work on stage and film, alongside some of the biggest stars in Hollywood. He worked with Al Pacino in Glengarry Glen Ross, Judy Davis in The Ref, and Benicio del Toro in Swimming with Sharks. But his major breakthrough occurred in 1995, when he starred in Bryan Singer's neo-noir film The Usual Suspect, which garnered him an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. That same year, he appeared in David Fincher's Seven, which many believe to be the best crime thriller of all time. It wouldn't be until he was on set that same year, shooting for the movie Outbreak, that Spacey would go on to approach another sexual partner, although at this time, they were at least over the age of 18. While on the set of Outbreak, Mark Ebenhock was working as a military advisor when one of Kevin's on-set assistants approached him. Spacey always had a harem of young assistants, who he was surrounded by. Most of the production joked were there to satisfy his sexual appetite. Despite that, one day, Ebenhock was approached by an assistant and directly asked if he would like to have sex with Spacey. He declined, and avoided Spacey for the remainder of the shoot. The next year, while directing the movie Albino Alligator, Spacey would go on to sexually harass another crew member who was 22 years old. The John Doe described Spacey as initially incredibly friendly and kind, taking the time to talk to him and other members of the crew with respect, which is exceedingly rare. He felt valued by the star director and didn't feel as if anything was amiss. In an interview with the BBC, he stated that Kevin was, quote, very affable and nice to everybody. We shook hands and he took an interest in me. He offered to watch one of my student films, which I was very flattered by. However, his kindness had strings attached. On one occasion, he told the crew member to sit in his director's chair and began to massage his neck and shoulders. He tried to steer clear of the director after that incident, feeling as if his boundaries were being crossed. But on at least one day of the shoot, Kevin found him, sat down next to him, and pressed their thighs together and began to push his hand up the man's inner thigh. He quickly left the situation, but the whole encounter made him feel uneasy. In the same interview with the BBC, he reported feeling unsure of the situation, saying, quote, I was getting the attention of the most powerful person on the movie set, and I wanted to work in Hollywood, he said. But it was an interest that made me feel totally uneasy, uncomfortable, and confused. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. I felt harassed, sexually harassed. At this point, Kevin was a full-blown celebrity and revered as one of the best actors in the industry. In 1999, he starred in American Beauty and won his second Oscar and received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He also starred in The Iceman Cometh and garnered another Tony Award nomination. In a relatively short span, he had reached the level of fame most people aspire to. He had worked with some of the greats and could do anything he wanted. And what he wanted to do, according to him, was give back. In 2003, Spacey announced that he was going to become the artistic director of the Old Vic, which was one of London's oldest, most prestigious theaters. He had been involved with the theater since the mid-90s, when he starred in several productions there. However, in 1998, when the theater had almost shut down, Spacey saved the day, campaigning to raise funds for the historic site. He used his celebrity to bring in more than $2 million to save the theater, and following that, he became one of their most significant donors. Being a donor at the theater had significant perks, like being allowed to access the site at all times, going to shows, and getting backstage, although those perks were things he could get off of his celebrity alone. But it seemed Kevin wanted more. He wanted to use the theater to meet and prey on other men, and when he was named artistic director in 2003, he did just that. These claims would only come to light after Anthony Rapp would come forward in 2017, but through the mid-90s through 2015, Kevin would so commonly sexually harass and molest young men in the theater that it became sort of a joke. Mexican actor Robert Cavazzo stated in a post on Facebook that Kevin had touched him inappropriately numerous times, and he used the Old Vic as a hunting ground. Another actor came forward anonymously and stated that Kevin would touch him inappropriately and molest him in public, and despite people seeing, no one would stop him. Another journalist corroborated Spacey's use of the Old Vic as a predatory hunting ground, citing that when he was in his early 20s, he interviewed Spacey in his office at the theater. After the interview was finished, Kevin invited the interviewer to have some drinks at a club, at which point he aggressively started to grope the man's genitals over his clothes, refusing to listen when the man told him to stop. The journalist told him he wasn't interested and was in a committed relationship with a woman. Kevin didn't care though, and according to BuzzFeed, had become convinced that this was a sexual liaison that they both wanted to take part in. The journalist continued to try to leave, and Spacey got so upset that, quote, he was screaming in my face outside of the main bar area, red-faced, spit flying out of his mouth, screaming at me with fury because I didn't want to fuck him. He was actually saying that I did want to and I was a coward. That was his tactic, and it was unbelievable. The journalist reported the incident to his editor at the time, and the story ran without his name attached. Though he wanted to report the horrifying incident, he instead kept quiet, as Kevin was still in the closet. However, after realizing that that kept other victims of Kevin from speaking out on what he had done, he stated that Kevin had weaponized his sexuality in that way. In 2017, after Anthony Rapp came forward, the Old Vic would set up a confidential email to receive tips and personal reports about the actor's behavior. The higher-ups at the theater maintained that they were completely unaware that he had been inappropriate while working in any capacity, but they quickly received over 20 emails of personal reports about how Kevin had been assaulting men in the theater. Many also claimed that the higher-ups and people in charge turned a blind eye, as Kevin typically would molest men in front of them and they didn't care. As Kevin worked and preyed on the actors at the Old Vic, he continued to act in various movies and stage shows and likewise continued to molest the men he came into contact with. In 2003, he molested director Tony Montana in a bar. Spacey allegedly approached Montana, groped his genitals, and stated that, quote, this designates ownership. He then tried to follow Montana to the bathroom after he pushed Spacey off of him, and he told the men that Spacey had arrived with that they needed to take him home. In 2007, bartender Chris Nixon met Spacey when Spacey came into a bar he worked at, located near the Old Vic. Spacey became friendly with Nixon and invited him to a party. Unlike the other occasions where Spacey had lied about throwing a party to get a person alone, he actually had thrown a small get-together, and Nixon, thinking he and Spacey were just good friends, brought his girlfriend along with him. While at the party, Kevin sat down next to Nixon and without warning grabbed his dick, stating that he could fuck him better than his girlfriend. Chris was shocked and immediately got up and left, feeling as if he had been violated by the famous actor. 2 weeks after he'd been groped, Kevin came into Nixon's bar while he was on shift and followed the bartender down to a basement storeroom where he once again assaulted Nixon and told him he would, quote, make it up to him. Once again, Nixon removed himself from the situation, feeling incredibly violated by the actor. That same year, writer Ari Ben was groped by Kevin at an after-party for an event hosted by Spacey and Uma Thurman. At the event, Kevin sat next to Ari, groped his genitals under a table, and asked him if he wanted to go outside for a cigarette, which Ari stated he laughed off as a joke, completely unaware as to how serious Kevin was about his offer, and how he was one of the many men Kevin had harassed. In 2008, Kevin would go on to assault Harry Dreyfus, son of Oscar-winning actor Richard Dreyfuss. The following is Harry's account as to what had happened in an article he wrote for BuzzFeed News. When I was an 18-year-old senior in high school, Kevin Spacey groped me. It was 2008, and he was directing my father, Richard Dreyfuss, in a play called Complicit at the Old Vic in London. I'd come to visit for Christmas break. It happened one night when the three of us were alone in Kevin's apartment rehearsing my father's lines. My father didn't see, and I didn't tell him about the incident for many years. Instead, I spent the next 9 years telling people the story at parties for laughs. I lived by Carrie Fisher's brilliant line, "If my life wasn't funny, it would just be true, and that is unacceptable." Telling the story as a joke ensured that this was a story I could own. If I could laugh at it, then surely I was not a victim. As a young storyteller from a family dedicated to seeing the funny side of the absurd, this was my way of defanging the whole thing. The technique fell apart once I got to college and started telling the story to the people in the theater world in New York. They would respond by saying, "I know a guy that happened to as well." The victims in many of these stories were often young men. These admissions became so common that I started to plan on a break in the story just so people could nod and say, "Oh yeah, I've heard this before." All of these responses made me realize there wasn't anything funny about my story, and it wasn't a joke. We were in Kevin's kitchen and my dad ducked out for a moment to go to the bathroom. Kevin and I were looking out of his window at the lights of London when he came to my side and asked me how my Christmas had been. I had had a terrible Christmas, I told him. Because I was too shy, I was 18, I'd mustered the courage to leave our hotel to get legally drunk for the first time in my life, but I didn't have the nerve to speak with anyone. Instead, I had a few drinks and then promptly returned to my hotel room to watch Tropic Thunder for the 4th time. After I'd told him that, Kevin slid his hand into mine. He wrapped his fingers between my fingers and peered into my eyes and warmly said, "Don't be shy, then you'll get over it." I was stunned. Finally, the three of us moved into his living room to read the script. My dad sat in a big chair on the side of the room while Kevin and I sat on his couch. Kevin was sitting extremely close to me, but I didn't blink because Kevin handed me the script and told me to read with my dad, playing the part of his wife. The only thing going through my mind at this time was how amazing it was that I was getting to act in front of one of my idols. After a few minutes, he put his hand on my thigh. Finally, I became suspicious. It took that long because it just never occurred to me that Kevin would be interested in me in the first place. He was an adult man, a hero of mine, my dad's boss, none of which were categories on my radar for sexual interactions. Besides, I thought, surely he can't be coming on to me like this in front of my dad. But his hand stayed there, so after a bit, I came up with what I thought was a brilliant safety tactic. I stood up and walked to the other side of the couch and sat back down, bulletproof. But without missing a beat, Kevin stood up too and followed me and sat just as close and immediately put his hand back on my thigh. My dad saw none of this and none of what would follow because he was deeply focused on his script. So I stood up one more time and returned to my original place on the couch, giving Kevin another opportunity to take the hint. I also added one more layer of protection. The moment I sat down, I firmly placed my own hands upon my own thighs, palms down, claiming that territory for myself. Once again, Kevin followed me, sat down, and with considerable effort, slid his hand between my right hand and my right leg. He'd snuck in. At this point, I didn't think there was anything I could do short of alarming my dad as to what was happening, but I didn't want to start a feud between them. I didn't want the play to be threatened. This job really mattered to my dad, and Kevin was his boss. And besides, I thought, he isn't really doing anything wrong. And then he did. Over the course of about 20 seconds, centimeter by centimeter, Kevin crawled his hand from my thigh over towards my crotch. My mind went blank. Suddenly, he had completed his journey, and now he had all of me in his hand. I stopped reading the script, and my eyes went wide. I lifted my head and faced him. Looking into his eyes, I gave the most meager shake of my head that I could manage. I was trying to warn him without alarming my dad, who still had his eyes glued to the page. I thought I was protecting everyone. I was protecting my dad's career. I was protecting Kevin, who my dad surely would have tried to punch, and I was protecting myself. Because I thought one day I'd want to work with this man. Kevin had no reaction and kept his hand there. My eyes went back to the script and I kept reading. I didn't know how long we sat there like that. It could have been as little as 20 seconds or it could have been 5 minutes. It's the hardest part of the story for me to recall. What I do remember is that, other than being a shy kid who obviously admired Kevin Spacey a lot, I never once gave him a signal that I would want him to be with me in that way. Kevin had grown so used to a celebrity being honored and his position as a director, actor, and the artistic director at the Old Vic, and being so respected in his industry that he felt he could molest someone in front of their own family. For years, Harry kept the story to himself, and then began telling it as a joke, trying in earnest to find the humor in it. However, the more he spoke about it, the more people supplemented his story with their own tales of Kevin molesting them at the theater or on the job. By this time, Kevin clearly had a modus operandi down, and it seemed as if many of the productions he would take part in were more than aware of his bad behavior, as he would regularly molest cast and crew. However, little was done to stop Kevin. That same year, another anonymous man spoke of being assaulted by Kevin, saying that he approached Kevin privately and asked him for tips in starting his own career in acting. Kevin and the man spoke for a while, and then went back to Spacey's apartment, where they both smoked weed. The man ended up passing out in his home and woke up to Spacey performing oral sex on him. He allegedly pushed Spacey off of him and left without a word. His career was still going strong, so much so that he had opted to do a bevy of independent films and comedies, stating in one interview that he felt like his career was in such a solid place he was more interested in doing things that were fun and interesting, rather than taking on intense projects that demanded a lot from him. In 2012, though, he would be cast in a career-defining role as Frank Underwood in the Netflix show House of Cards. The show debuted to critical and fan acclaim, and he was able to get 1 Golden Globe as well as 2 SAG Awards for his role. However, as with every set Kevin had been on, he turned it into his hunting ground. Multiple cast and crew members reported being sexually harassed by Spacey, starting from when the show began production in 2011. A total of 8 sources stated that Spacey's behavior was explicitly predatory, and he had a proclivity to initiate non-consensual contact with production crew. It was noted that he particularly liked young or young-looking men. One crew member reported that Spacey would routinely touch him inappropriately during the 6 seasons he worked on the set, and never felt comfortable asking Spacey to stop, given his position as star and producer. Another production assistant, who had likewise been groped on the set, had reported Spacey's behavior. However, Netflix solved the problem not by reprimanding Spacey or penalizing him in any way, but moving the assistant so he would not be in contact with Spacey for the remainder of his time working on the set. After this, Spacey would set his sights on another production assistant, this time molesting them when they were driving together. Though it seemed that everyone who worked with Kevin had their own assault story, his reputation stayed mostly intact, as many knew if they were to come forward, they would either be outing him or they wouldn't be believed. Many knew the culture around Hollywood elites, and seen what had happened to women like Rose McGowan, who had spoken up about how she had been assaulted and then been blacklisted. According to one of the anonymous men who Kevin molested, if you talked to anyone about it to people, they would be sympathetic, but to a point. There was always that underlying idea that that was what show business was just like, and you had to get over it. Casting couches and sleeping with producers was just a part of the deal. That was the price of fame, and I always felt as if people thought I just couldn't hack it. Everything could change when the New York Times and the New Yorker reported that more than a dozen women accused Hollywood producer and co-founder of Miramax, Harvey Weinstein, of sexual harassment, assault, and rape. These articles were published after the beginning of the Me Too movement, which empowered women to speak out about sexual abuse and harassment they had faced in their lives. Though allegations, lawsuits, and reports had been made earlier about Weinstein, many people in Hollywood were well aware of his cantankerous behavior. The public had always hand-waved his transgressions and ignored the accusations that had been proven against him in court. But this time, things were different. Multiple celebrities like Kate Beckinsale, Cate Blanchett, Gwyneth Paltrow, Cara Delevingne, and Lupita Nyong'o came forward and spoke about how he had cornered them and tried to assault them. Many of them had spoken about it prior to 2017, but it seemed as if now people were listening. Anthony Rapp saw this change and thought back to his own experience being sexually assaulted as a child, and he decided to speak on it. He publicly told his story as to what had happened to him when he was 14 years old, and Spacey had tried to sleep with him. And within the days that followed, more people came forward with their own stories and spoke about how this was well known in the theater and production communities that Kevin was a part of. The same day that the allegations were made public, Kevin responded via Twitter, saying that he didn't remember the events that Anthony spoke about, but he was sure if they had occurred, it had simply been because he had been too drunk. He also used the opportunity to come out as a gay man, which many prominent gay men and women criticized, as he tried to use his coming out to deflect from the assault. Kevin was dropped by his agent and most of his management. Netflix severed ties with the actor, killing off his character from House of Cards and pulling the plug on other projects that were set to move forward with him at the helm. Movies that he was set to star in spent millions editing around him and replacing him entirely, and Spacey seemed to quietly retire. However, December 2018, Kevin made his return to public life with a YouTube video titled Let Me Be Frank.
I know what you want. Oh, sure, they may have tried to separate us, but what we have is too strong, it's too powerful. I mean, after all, we shared everything, you and I. I told you my deepest, darkest secrets. I showed you exactly what people are capable of. I shocked you with my honesty, but mostly I challenged you and made you think. And you trusted me, even though you knew you shouldn't. So we're not done, no matter what anyone says. And besides, I know what you want. You want me back. Of course, some believed everything and had just been waiting with bated breath to hear me confess it all. They're just dying to have me declare that everything said is true and that I got what I deserved. Wouldn't that be easy if it was all so simple? Only you and I both know it's never that simple, not in politics and not in life. But you wouldn't believe the worst without evidence, would you? You wouldn't rush to judgments without facts, would you? Did you? No, not you. You're smarter than that. Anyway, all this presumption made for such an unsatisfying ending, and to think it could have been such a memorable send-off. I mean, if you and I have learned nothing else these past years, it's that in life and art, nothing should be off the table. We weren't afraid, not of what we said and not of what we did, and we're still not afraid. Because I can promise you this. If I didn't pay the price for the things we both know I did do, I'm certainly not going to pay the price for the things I didn't do. Oh, of course, they're going to say I'm being disrespectful, not playing by the rules, like I ever played by anyone's rules before. I never did, and you loved it. Anyhow, despite all the poppycock, the animosity, the headlines, the impeachment without a trial, despite everything, despite even my own death, I feel surprisingly good. And my confidence grows each day that soon enough you will know the full truth. Well, wait a minute. Now that I think of it, you never actually saw me die, did you? Conclusions can be so deceiving. Miss me?
The video was incredibly strange and ominous, as Kevin spoke as his character, Frank Underwood, and referenced the allegations made against him. Many fans of House of Cards praised his acting ability in the comments, stating the show had gone to shit without him, and that this one video was better than the entirety of the season he was removed from. But others felt like him saying, "Besides, I know what you want," to the audience after years of sexually assaulting people and not taking no for an answer to be alarming. That same month, Kevin faced his first lawsuit from the allegations, but the lawsuit was later dropped when, due to the amount of time that had passed, it was found that key evidence had gone missing. In 2019, Kevin was being investigated for another criminal complaint. However, the investigation was closed when the complainant mysteriously and suddenly died. Despite the legal issues, in 2019, Kevin put out another video as Frank, titled KTWK, which stood for Kill Them With Kindness. Here's the video.
You didn't really think I was going to miss the opportunity to wish you a Merry Christmas, did you? It's been a pretty good year, and I'm grateful to have my health back. And in light of that, I've made some changes in my life, and I'd like to invite you to join me. As we walk into 2020, I want to cast my vote for more good in this world. Ah, yes, I know what you're thinking. Can he be serious? I'm dead serious. And it's not that hard, trust me. The next time someone does something you don't like, you can go on the attack, but you can also hold your fire and do the unexpected. You can kill them with kindness.
It should be stated that this video was released, and 8 days after, another one of his accusers died suddenly, leading many to suspect foul play, although there was and is no proof of that. In 2020, Spacey and his production companies, M Profit and Trigger Street Productions, were ordered to pay $31 million to MRC, the company that produced House of Cards, as he had violated their sexual harassment policy in a way that damaged the entire company. That same year, he made another Christmas video, this time dropping the Frank Underwood character to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. As of today, in 2022, he has recently been charged by the Crown Prosecution Service in the United Kingdom, stemming from 3 separate complaints of sexual assault. The case is ongoing, and despite his legal woes, Kevin has returned to working in Hollywood. According to IMDb, he is starring in the movie Gateway to the West, Peter 5'8", and The Man That Drew God, and given his YouTube comments, there are some people avidly awaiting his return. There is no neat and tidy way to end this video. The accusations against Kevin have gone back for years. He was one of the most well-known men working in Hollywood, and most who worked with him knew about his predatory behavior. His return to Hollywood is not shocking nor surprising, but in a year's time, given the trial against him, hopefully we will see justice done. Thank you for watching this episode of Dreading. If you want to support the channel, consider joining our Patreon. If you like this video and like true crime content, feel free to like and subscribe and leave a comment, as it helps us in the algorithm. With that said, have a wonderful day and remember to stay safe.